Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute here at Rice University in Houston. And this is the Kinder Institute Urban Reads series. The Kinder Institute Urban Reads series showcases recently published books by regional and national authors on topics of interest to the Kinder Institute audience. Today, we're talking about the new book, The Texas Triangle, co-authored by Henry Cisneros, David Hendricks in San Antonio, Colum Clark in Dallas, and myself. We have three panels, as I said earlier. David and Henry will talk about the book to begin with, then Colum will talk about, lead a discussion of the Triangle as a mega region, and then I will lead a discussion about economic development efforts coordinating across the Triangle. We ask today that you tweet using the hashtag KIUrbanReads, that's hashtag KIUrbanReads. You can follow us on Twitter at RiceKinderInst, I-N-S-T, RiceKinderInst. And now it's time, the first thing I'd like to do is thank our friends at CenterPoint Energy. The Urban Read series is made possible thanks to our friends at CenterPoint. And I'd like, the title sponsor of this lecture series, and I'd like to turn it over to Tracy Yonda for CenterPoint, a native of the Texas Triangle, I might add. To make a few remarks. Tracy, are you there?
I am.
I know you're there. There you go.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to extend greetings on behalf of CenterPoint Energy. We're pleased to be the sponsor for the 2021 Kinder Institute Urban Read Speaker Series, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists today. While many on this webinar think of CenterPoint Energy primarily as the electric and gas utility serving the Houston metro area, customers in over 70 counties in East and South Texas know us as the gas company. Many of these customers live within the Texas Triangle mega region, which is the focus of today's event. And their homes and businesses rely on safe, reliable energy delivery every day. That reliable energy delivery is crucial to the economic prosperity of these communities. And so we take pride in playing that role in the physical and economic infrastructure of our state. On a personal note, as Bill mentioned, I'm a native Texan, grew up in a small town west of Houston. And so I looked forward to grabbing a copy of this book and getting a chance to read it before today's event. Found it to be a really interesting combination, a refresher for me of 7th grade Texas history, as well as so much robust data that I'm going to have to keep it on the shelf to pull it out occasionally to refer to. So I hope everybody on the webinar today enjoys the event and goes out and buys their own copy of the book. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd also like to acknowledge some of our other sponsors, although CenterPoint is the title sponsor for this series. Generous support for the Kinder Institute comes through a multi-year grant from Houston Endowment. We rely on philanthropic investments from other contributors. Special thanks go to Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, the Baxter Trust, Chevron, JP Morgan Chase Foundation, Wells Fargo, the Cullen Foundation, Raynette and Stan Merrick, PNC Bank, Claire and Eric Anya, Catherine and Hank Coleman, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, Bank of America, Bracewell, HEB, and the United Way of Greater Houston. So now I'd like to turn it over to our first panel, talking about just introducing the concept of the Texas Triangle, a little bit about what it is. Two of the four authors of this book, Henry Cisneros, former mayor of San Antonio, former HUD secretary and chairman of American III Partners, and David Hendricks, former business editor and columnist for the San Antonio Express News, the San Antonio contributors to this book. So Henry and David, I'll turn it over to you for right now.
Bill, thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking you for organizing today's webinar, for your role in being a critical player as a co-author, your background as a mayor yourself, planning director for San Diego, author of numerous books in urban planning, made you a very valuable member of this team, and certainly anchoring the Houston corner of the Triangle by virtue of your position at the Kinder Institute and Rice. So thank you very much. And for organizing today's sponsors, including the title sponsor, CenterPoint Energy. I want to thank Colum Clark, who not only anchored the Dallas portion of the Triangle on our team, but has his own enviable reputation as an economist at SMU and with the Bush Institute in Dallas. I'm joined today by David Hendricks, who we office together here in San Antonio. David has a history of 45 years as a business writer at the Express News, and at times was editor, other points was the representative of the newspaper in Austin during the legislative sessions. So he really knows this end of the triangle, but the triangle as a whole. Let me just say quickly, by way of introduction, the origins of this effort, the origins of this book are the experience that all of us have had in our respective cities, but with the view and a recognition that the major cities of Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth in the north, Houston, Galveston in the southeast, Austin and San Antonio anchoring the southwest corner of the triangle, really work together more closely than most cities across the country. We have distance between us, 200 and 250 miles on the edges of the triangle, but are all within the same state, obviously, and that's a rarity. Texas now has 3 of the 10 largest cities in America within its boundaries. Houston number 4, San Antonio number 7, and Dallas number 9 in the top 10 among the country. Austin sits at number 11, and we expect when the results come in from the 2020 census that Austin will displace San Jose, the present number 10, and Texas will, for the first time in the history of the United States, be a state that had 4 cities within the top 10 most populous within its boundaries. And Fort Worth sits at number 13 today. I don't know what the census will do to increase its position, but we will have all 5 of the critical portions of the triangle very, very close to being in the top 10 most populous in the country. That's a really important historical fact because it's never happened in American history before. And when it did, it was in the Northeast when New York and Brooklyn and Buffalo were top 10 cities. And then later in California, when San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco were top 10 cities, but never has a state had 4, verging on 5 of the 10 most populous cities in the country. I've traveled the triangle for the last 40 years in various capacities as a city council member, as a mayor, as a HUD secretary, president of the Texas Municipal League, et cetera, and really fell in love with the various cities of the state. And in recent years have come to understand the power that they have in a combined way, each with their own strengths, as we'll focus today, but functioning together. David Hendricks did magnificent work, research work, in pinning down a lot of facts about the triangle. We decided that we would define the triangle as the 35 counties surrounding Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, Galveston, and Austin, San Antonio. Came to 35 counties. And those 35 counties, out of 254 counties in Texas, represent 66% of the population of the state. 66% of Texas in 35 counties out of 254. And they represent 77% of the GDP that is created in Texas. So there's no question that the land of great wide open spaces and ranches and oil wells of Texas history and mythology is giving way to a different reality. Places a state that is pulled, the economic engine that is pulled by the activities in these really profoundly important, nationally significant urban places. And there's great reason to support their growth and continued emergence because they are the revenue base of Texas. They're the economic and jobs base of Texas. They're the engine that will determine the future of this state. David and I we're not doing an interview, we're doing a conversation, and so far I've been doing all the talking. So let me turn it over to David by asking a question. David, sometimes when somebody sets out to write a book, they have a central theme in mind, and ours was what I've just described. But as you worked on the book, what did you learn and did it alter your thinking about the central team? David Hendricks, business writer at the Express News for 45 years, and now working on urban research together with the rest of this team. David.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Bill, for kicking off this webinar. I think the overarching goal and theme that I was thinking about as I worked on this book is to simply change the image of the state. We're just not ranches and farms and oil fields anymore. We're a unique, diversified urban state. You've already given the statistic that 66% of the Texas population lives in the 3 corners of the triangle. That's only 14% of the counties in Texas, and they have 2/3 of the people who live here. And I just, every day I came to work, I did research and just came up with whatever I could find, and it just became more amazing every day. The Triangle is home to 48 Fortune 500 companies. That's nearly 10% of the corporate base in one state. I think only California and New York have more, but Texas has become a leader in the corporate world. We have a gross domestic product of $1.3 trillion. That would be the world's 15th largest economy, just those 35 counties. And I started to do comparisons of the 3 corners in terms of economic size, and I found it easiest to compare them to other whole countries. And I don't think anybody has done that type of comparison before. Dallas-Fort Worth metro area has an economy the size of Sweden. The Houston metro economy is slightly larger than the one in Belgium. In the 3rd corner, with San Antonio and Austin, those 2 metros combined have an economy the size of Egypt. And when I say that the 35 counties is the 15th largest economy in the world, we're just under Spain and just above Mexico if we were on the list. Texas has led international trade among the 50 states for at least a decade. And Texas has 25 metropolitan areas defined as a metro where the core city has a population of at least 50,000 people. Texas has 25 of those, including the 4 big ones that are in the triangle. And Texas is number 2. California has 26 metropolitan areas, even though it has a population of 3 million more than Texas. But Texas is just 1 below. Those 25 metropolitan areas make the idea of Texas as an urban state even stronger. In other words, Texas, 85% of the Texas population lives in an urban metro. That leaves 15% that is rural. And we don't slight rural Texas in this book at all. We devoted a whole chapter to it. The rural, even just the 15% is the largest rural economy in the United States. And by itself, it has a population about the size of Oklahoma, which means that the rural population, if it were by itself, could have its own state legislature and its own government. But Texas is still 85% urban, and that makes this a very complex state to govern. And we're certainly grappling with that on the government front. I think my main hope is that this book changes the image of Texas, that it's and helps boost its image as an active player on the national and global stage.
So David, let's focus in on that last point. Obviously, one of the themes of the book is that because Texas is as urban as it is, and because the triangle is as prominent as it is in a national and even global sense, and we could get into why each of the points of the triangle is important nationally or globally, that it is critical that the Texas leadership, and I say leadership writ large, it's not just the governor, the state leaders, the legislature, but business leaders, chambers of commerce, civic leaders, and others recognize that it doesn't make sense to create artificial political fights between the urban areas and the rural areas, or the cultural issues that have seemed to dominate our political discussion in recent years, when what we need to be doing is advancing and building and strengthening these engines that have such significance and power. Houston and the port and the medical complex and the space complex, and of course the energy complex, Dallas and its transportation hub role traditionally, along with its technology and general business and cultural significance. Austin, of course, the state capital, with the University of Texas there, and the massive growing technology complex that legitimately now rivals, or at least begins to rival, Silicon Valley. That's been talked about for years, but now with Tesla moving its major facilities there, and Oracle moving its world headquarters, and just in the last year, we see that that's a reality. San Antonio, with its long standing biomedical capabilities, cybersecurity capabilities, military facilities, and tourism, carries its own weight. It just doesn't make sense for the leadership of Texas to attack the cities, as we have seen, restricting their annexation powers, sanctuary cities fights, shorting some of the budget allocations, battles over education, most recently efforts to restrict the city's ability to hire lobbyists to fight for legislation. It's almost as if we're creating artificial wedge issues to demonize the urban areas at the very time we're seeing them emerge and become forces that can pull the rest of Texas along in the years to come. Is that an overstatement, David, of the case?
No, not at all. The Texas Triangle metro areas are the ones that fund the vast part of the state budget. And that doesn't seem to count for anything within our, among some of our state leadership. We look at the regular legislative session that just ended, and we see them concentrating on social behavior issues like a transgender sports ban, or new voting restrictions, or open carry on guns, or playing the national anthem and requiring more patriotism and instruction. This doesn't advance the cities in any way, and it's kind of disappointing. and nothing substantial was done to address the conditions that led to the February freeze and the power grid collapse. What I've been trying to think of, and I don't know if you have any thoughts, what will it take for large Texas cities to work together better to bring attention to their challenges and get them higher up on the priorities?
Well, I think that's an important corollary to our work, is the hope that the cities, just as they're represented in today's panel, we have leaders of chambers of commerce and leaders of economic development efforts from across the state, will understand the importance of collaborating together, because while there's distance between our cities, there isn't another place in America where cities rank this high among the most populous cities in the country, are within the same state, bound by the same legislative realities, dependent on the same state budget, and who are operating under the same regime of educational initiatives, health policies, transportation allocations, et cetera. So there really is the vast importance of working together within the state. And it's the right thing to do. David, in terms of the challenges before the triangle, you've touched on some, but obviously making sure the educational systems are strong, both public school as well as higher education. We know all across America, there's the model of metro areas pulled by giant universities, whether it's Stanford in Silicon Valley or the Harvard complex, MIT complex in Boston. We don't have time today to focus on just how dynamic a model that is, but Texas deserves, these Texas metros deserve tier 1 research institutions and then also human capital for training. Health, obviously a gap in Texas with the number of uninsured people we have, but many of those live in the urban areas. Housing has been a bright spot for the triangle because we've had affordable housing, but in some places like Austin, the prices are beginning to push California levels. So the need to create affordable supply is clear, and do it in such a way that it doesn't exacerbate the transportation and congestion problems. That's another issue we have to address. Austin is doing an admirable job on its own of passing a bond issue in last fall that about $7 billion worth of transit. And Houston has done a good job of staying ahead, but it's hard to stay ahead when the growth rates are so significant. And then there's the climate change issues, which affect us all. In some parts of the triangle, it's more a question of adequacy of water for the possibility of future droughts. In other places, it's the violence of storms like Hurricane Harvey in Houston and the need to have an infrastructure that can handle the volume of what will be more violent storms if the predictions about climate change and weather patterns are correct. Not to mention sea level rise in Houston with the ship channel and the amount of energy facilities along the ship channel. So there is serious work to be done on these questions, and doing it from the template, from the perspective of supporting these urban areas seems to me to be the way to proceed. David, we make the claim that the triangle is significant in a global sense. Apart from comparisons, what is the significance of the triangle in the global setting? Is it principally about trade? How would you see that?
It's about trade mostly, and the Port of Houston, and we have an appendix that lists all the international connections at DFW, Houston Intercontinental, Hobby, San Antonio, Austin Bergstrom airports. we're sending and receiving people from all over the world, from every continent except for maybe Antarctica. So, our education systems are reaching out with universities and with branches in Mexico and China.
David, how confident are you that the trends we outlined in this book will continue? Is this just a momentary migration, momentary population growth story that will follow what we have seen in other parts of the country that had their prime moment, their pinnacle moment, and then they decline? Or are we just scratching the surface in terms of understanding the significance of what's happening right now?
I think we're on a trend that is rising steadily and with stability. I think even during the pandemic, there's anecdotal evidence of quite a few people moving from California, for example, to Texas. We're seeing that in the housing market, where Austin has maybe 200 houses on the market at any one time. That's like 2 days of growth for that city. We're seeing evidence of outside investors buying houses in San Antonio, not to live here, but just to invest in them, because it's probably a better bet than, say, stocks or bonds. So I think one theme of the book is that the economic and population base of the United States is shifting more toward the Texas Triangle than anywhere else, and the statistics in the book show that.
The issue of diversity and leadership, inclusion, including racial inclusion and so forth, we touch on that in the book because it's so important in these cities. The cities are more diverse than the rest of Texas, therefore more complex. We need to focus on developing leadership in those places that represents them, but that really thinks about Texas as a whole as well. You have any thoughts on that point?
Well, you were talking about the challenges that the Triangle face, and it does, mainly from all the growth that all of the urban areas are experiencing. But the beauty of the Texas Triangle to me is that each metro area has its own specialties, and it's like parts of a puzzle that fit together. It becomes a cohesive whole. There's a diversity that has allowed Texas to weather economic recessions in the past more with less problems than other parts of the country, because of the cohesiveness and the diversity of the metro areas.
So, Bill, I think you can tell from David's comments that we had the right person serving as the kind of quarterback of our effort and the chief searcher for our effort. And David told me the other day, we were leaving the office in the parking lot, that after 45 years in journalism and business writing and covering governments in Austin, this was, he felt like this book was a capstone for his work. He's very proud to be part of this.
Great.
David, I'll let you speak for yourself, but you might want to repeat for those watching today how you feel about this book.
Well, I had more than 40 years of a journalism career, and not counting working for school newspapers. To have an opportunity to do this kind of research and writing without a daily deadline it's just a wonderful experience. And you started me on this topic, and the more I worked on it, the more fascinating it became.
Bill, with that, we'll hand it over to you and the panelists that follow. Thank you for giving us a chance to provide an overview.
Thank you, Henry and David. That was wonderful. We're going to turn now to our next panel, the Triangle's role as a mega region. Our moderator on this is another one of our co-authors, Cullum Clark, the director of the George W. Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative in Dallas. Cullum, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce the panelists. In the book, there's a chapter that was researched and written primarily by Cullum that compares the Texas Triangle to some of the other mega regions in the country, the Northeast Corridor, Southern California, et cetera. So it's a little hard to tell. Oh, there you are, Cullum. So why don't you go ahead and introduce your panelists, and we'll get going.
Thanks. I'll double check that you can hear me, Bill.
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Bill said, I'm an economist, a lifelong Texan with deep roots in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I'll join Bill, first of all, in saying how delighted I've really been to share in this project alongside Henry, David, and Bill. It's really been an honor and a tremendous collaboration. And thank you also to Bill and the Kinder Institute for putting on this event. As Bill said, our second session is about the Texas Triangle's role as a mega region within the United States, within the world economy, in particular, its demographic and economic realities. Now, we're very honored to be joined by two panelists who are deep experts in the economic and demographic realities of our state and of the metro areas within it. Dr. Lloyd Potter, who is the Texas State demographer, and Amanda Edwards, former Houston City Councilwoman and former candidate for the United States Senate. I could do much longer introductions of both of them, but I think in the interest of time, we should keep it moving and hear from everyone. What I'd like to do in this session is to share a few thoughts, a few summary points from the book about essentially the idea of the triangle as a mega region, to profile it a little bit, and then open it up to a discussion. So I'll be quick in this introductory section, but I think it's good to lay out a few additional facts in addition to what Henry and David just said. So as Henry and David said, a core goal in this book is to make the case that it makes good sense, makes increasing sense to think of the Texas Triangle, these somewhat disparate metropolitan areas, as a geographic unit, as what we call a mega region. It makes sense also increasingly, as for reasons Henry articulated very well, for them to act like they are a mega unit, i.e. coordinate their efforts, because they have very common challenges, very common opportunities. I mean, for example, we make the case in the book that if you compare any one of the four big metropolitan areas to other big metro areas around the United States, they actually have much more in common in all kinds of ways with each other, not just historical, but in terms of current numbers and so forth, than they do with most metropolitan areas elsewhere. And they increasingly constitute, we make the case in the book, a kind of cohesive, self-contained economic unit. For example, we show that they trade with each other in terms of goods and services much, much more than they do with metropolitan areas elsewhere, even very big ones like New York or Los Angeles. So we come at this in part of course, in the book, we do it in a historical way, but we also do it through a whole lot of contemporary data. And just to give you a quick sense of what we do, we develop data for the 8 largest mega regions, as we define them in the United States, and compare our mega region to the 7 others. And the others include, for example, the Northeast Corridor from Boston to DC, the urban Midwest from basically Pittsburgh to Chicago, Southern California, Northern California, and several more. And in a nutshell, we can say the following. Relative to the average of the other 7 big mega regions of the United States, the Texas Triangle has all of the following characteristics. It's younger in terms of its demographics. It's much faster growing. It's less white, more Hispanic, slightly less educated than the average, much more economically diverse in terms of its industry makeup. It's more lightly taxed, more permissive in its land use and business regulation policies, and more affordable for families and small businesses. As David noted, the economy is large. It's $1.3 trillion of GDP as of 2018. That's about 7% of the US economy. We show it's one of the largest mega region economies in the world, well ahead of, for example, the Northern California Bay Area, Southeastern England, including London, the Rhine, Ruhr Valley in Germany, or greater Beijing. We argue that the Texas Triangle, once you kind of define it as a unit, it actually defies a lot of stereotypes. It's a mistake, for example, to think that the Texas Triangle owes its success in recent decades to a cheap, if undereducated workforce. Actually, what we show is that people in the Texas Triangle metros earn more than their peers of comparable education levels in most other mega regions. To economists, that indicates that we're an exceptionally productive place. For the most part, we're also quite competitive with other metro areas in terms of our education levels within ethnic groups. However, if we have a little bit lower education levels than the average for the other mega regions, it reflects our demographic composition and the challenging reality that there are still significant disparities. I don't think I have to tell anyone here, across racial groups in our country, as well as in our state on a wide variety of metrics. We actually in the Triangle have lower poverty rates than most other peer regions. We have very rapidly changing demographics, as you're going to hear. For example, Asians catching up to Hispanics in terms of inbound immigration from other countries. The popular image of Texas as a deep red bastion of ideological conservatism bears very little relationship to the realities of metropolitan Texas, as we describe in the book. And it's also a mistake, we think, to argue that urban Texas is becoming more and more like the metropolitan centers on the coast, that we're all kind of converging to the same destination. We're actually becoming more economically diverse in the Triangle metros as some other places become more concentrated on individual industries like finance and tech. Gaps in terms of economic policy, housing, infrastructure, if anything, are growing, not shrinking. And I think that Triangle metros have maintained a very strong tradition of pragmatic urban and suburban politics, even as a number of other cities grow more ideologically polarized. We don't sugarcoat the tough realities in this book. We do certainly illustrate that we have this distinctive geographic model in all 4 Triangle metros, very rapid outward growth that has made all of the metros into relatively segregated places on income lines and created a risk of an increasingly what we would call donut-shaped geography. We have challenges with building an infrastructure that can keep up with all this growth, challenges with rising housing prices that are actually shrinking our edge relative to some of the coastal places, and certainly challenges with bringing an educational system into being that can prepare our workforce for 21st century work. I would say in conclusion, 3 quick conclusions from all of this analysis. Number 1, we illustrate in the book that the rise of the Texas Triangle is certainly changing the state. Second of all, that it does represent a kind of model for how to accommodate rapid population growth and growing demographic diversity while sustaining a lot of economic dynamism and relative affordability. And third, it's a harbinger of challenges other mega regions will face as they become larger and more diverse. That's what I had to say. Now I want to open it up to the group. Let's talk about the demographics. And Dr. Potter, I'd love to start with you. We all know there's been a huge inbound migration from elsewhere in the United States to the Texas Triangle and into our state more generally. Who's coming? Where are they coming from? And why are they coming? Could you tell us all about this big trend?
Sure. So about half of our population changes in Texas is from migration. I think many times when we talk about growth, we're thinking all the new Texans are coming from out of the state. About half of them are babies then. So we're growing a lot from natural increase, but certainly a significant proportion of our population changes from net migration. When we look at domestic migration, it accounts for a little more than sorry.
I have that too in our house.
Hopefully it'll stop here in a second. They were quiet, they've been quiet all morning. So when we look at population change in terms of migration, about 1/3 is domestic migration. And when we look at where they're coming from, California has consistently this past decade been the biggest net sender of domestic migrants. But we have a number of, a range of other states. They tend to be the large states, so like Florida, New York, Illinois, and that's where we see the most significant flow. We do have Texans that are leaving Texans net. So we look at Colorado, for example, has consistently been a net receiver of Texans. But by and large, again, a lot of people are coming from these large states. California consistently has been this big sender. And then when we look at international migration, we've seen a big shift in that since the 2000 to 2010 decade, which was dominated by immigration from Mexico, Central America. Post-recession, that flow just kind of stemmed pretty dramatically, and there were a couple of years where there were estimates of reverse migration to Mexico. And with that, we've seen, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, or somebody mentioned a little earlier, substantial increase in immigration from Asian countries. And so that's also been a very significant shift that we've seen as well. So certainly we're seeing, pretty dramatic growth from migration, but I don't want to throw out this idea of how much we're growing from natural increase, which has to do with another point you made earlier in the fact that we're a young state. We're one of the youngest states in terms of our labor force, and a lot of that, the bulk of that is concentrated in the population triangle. And that means we have a lot of people that are in the reproductive ages, relatively few people in the high mortality ages. And so we're adding a lot of new Texans just by this reproductive process.
Excellent, thank you. Councilwoman Edwards, can we turn to you? Maybe we start with, I know you've been all over the state in recent times, but maybe we start with your own city, your own metropolitan area. Obviously, there's been huge inbound migration into the Houston area from points all over the world. In your view, how is this changing the city and the wider region? We oftentimes hear Houston is America's most diverse metropolitan area. So as it becomes ever more so, what does this mean for this enormous metropolis, Houston?
Thank you so much for the question. And of course, thank you for having me on the panel. I think one of the huge strengths of the city of Houston in particular is its robust and rich diversity. And one of the things I think this increase in new people coming into the state, this diversity that we have being the most diverse in the nation, is really, it presents an opportunity and a challenge, which is how can Houston be the place where we're not only just the most diverse, but solving some of the challenges that diverse communities face. And so I think what this does is pose an opportunity for us to really think about issues of disparity, some of which were highlighted in your opening remarks, but also in terms of opportunity to build the infrastructure that will be needed to address this increase in population, but also one that requires us to be more inclusive. 142 languages are spoken in Houston, not all over Houston, but certainly 142 languages are logged. And so with that being said, are we making sure that we're reducing some of the barriers that some of our international populations face? That one thing that has been unique and interesting about the growth that we've experienced is the fact that so much of it is international as well. And so we are looking at issues such as making sure the economy is sound. That's part of what has been the lure to Houston, for example, but also making sure our education base is sound and that it continues to be strengthened. And I think Houston is not unique in that regard in terms of that being one of the challenges that we want to make sure we tackle and of course address.
So a follow-up question to you both. I'd love to ask both of you to address this one on demographics. So the official projections are that there's huge growth to come, that the Texas Triangle metros, when you add them up, will go from about 20 million people now to 35 million people by 2050, with 13 million people each in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston areas and 9 million in the combined San Antonio-Austin areas, which by that time will very likely be considered one metropolitan area by the census and other official voices. So this enormous growth, my question to you both, and Councilwoman Edwards, let's start with you. Is this really going to happen? And are we anywhere close to ready for it? Oh, I think Councilwoman Edwards
Okay, well, I'll jump in.
Wait, go for it, Dr. Potter.
So yeah, I mean, I think if we look at I was talking about the domestic migration, if we look at where many of the domestic migrants are moving to, they're the suburban ring counties. So if you look at the Houston area, Fort Bend and Montgomery counties, Waller County to the west, are just growing dramatically. And when you look at the people that are moving there, again, many of them are, well, actually, some of them, they're actually net out domestic migration from Harris County. And a lot of them a lot of people are moving out to the suburban ring counties. They're the same thing in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you look at the suburban ring counties, that's we're adding housing units, and those housing units are largely being filled by people that are moving here from other states or from other places within the state. The same thing if we look at San Antonio, Austin. I mean, it's just filling in very, very quickly between San Antonio and Austin, and going north up toward Waco. And so we're essentially, the urban cores have, the land use has become pretty well set, even though we're seeing some shifts there occurring. We're seeing, you know, some redevelopment and gentrification coming, and that's something also that's a policy issue that needs to be managed. But that said, if you look at the growth that's occurring, essentially it's happening in areas where, you know, 10 years ago they were cow fields, or they were it was agricultural, and now they're, you know, just building developments, apartment complexes in the middle of nowhere almost, and then in another 5 years it's all filled in all around it with retail and other housing units. So I would anticipate, you know, that the forecast that you have for the urban areas is that likely is going to continue. Of course, it's all somewhat dependent upon Texas continuing to be economically attractive, and us to continuing to grow businesses here. And that's dependent on a number of other things. So, I mean, certainly there's issues of water, power, transportation is a huge issue. Education of our labor force is a huge issue in terms of being able to continue to attract businesses to come here. Infrastructure around technology, I could go on and on, but maybe Councilwoman, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about projections or the forecast as well.
Well, Dr. Potter, you picked up on some of the key pieces that I would have highlighted. I was having a barking dog issue, so that makes
All three of us.
so I have had a relocation, just temporary. But in any event, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of making sure that we're prepared for all the growth. I mean, I used to sit on the board of the Transportation Policy Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization for the 8-county region for Houston and Galveston area. And in doing that, you know, one of the questions we were posed with, we were projecting about 4.2 million people coming into our 8-county region within the next couple of decades. And so what infrastructure is being put up today or being invested in today amid financial challenges that localities and municipalities and counties and others face that can address this growth? I think that's going to be a key piece of this, is making sure we're prepared for this continued increase, which is anticipated, but making sure we're making the investments today that are absolutely critical so that growth is being properly managed. Education, as was already stated by Dr. Potter, is obviously a huge component. Economic opportunity, reducing some of the barriers that a number of communities might face in terms of accessing education. What we've noticed, or not noticed for the first time, but certainly had a spotlight shown on the notion of the digital divide being a key issue in terms of communities that might have less access to broadband connectivity, for example. And so making the key necessary infrastructure investments, I think, are paramount. And of course, making sure you're reducing barriers that these diverse populations that are coming in are going to face.
And I would emphasize the infrastructure issues aren't something you can say, oh, we need to build infrastructure and it's going to be there tomorrow. It's like you have to look out ahead, and you have to say, okay, we know this is coming, or we believe it's coming, so we need to issue bonds and to plan freeways. It takes a lot of time and money and a lot of legal issues. So there are really some significant challenges if we don't anticipate and actually try to get ahead, or at least catch up to where our demands are for infrastructure.
Let's build on the theme of the economics, the economic changing economic realities of the Texas Triangle mega region. Just to point out a few more facts that are in our book, it's pretty interesting when you put the 4 mega regions together to observe that the region has the leading technology center between the coasts in Austin, the leading ground, air, and sea transportation hubs between the coasts, one of the 2 dominant financial centers between the coasts. That's really counting Dallas and Chicago in those 2 slots. Clearly the dominant centers for oil and gas and space in Houston, business services, probably in DFW, a manufacturing base that rivals any mega region in the United States, other than the #1, which is the urban Midwest area, the Rust Belt, and the largest medical complex in the world in Houston. That's a lot of strengths, a lot of which probably, if you put it all together, aren't really familiar to people. I guess I would ask you all both to reflect on what you see as the greatest economic strengths of the kind of the triangle, the big Texas metro areas, but also I think we've talked about inclusion, but maybe threats to the sustainability of what seems like this great economic success story. So Councilwoman Edwards, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. I think you highlighted also in some of your earlier remarks the fact that it's not just one industry driving growth. We're seeing growth in a way that is diversified. We're seeing more innovation, tech and innovation coming into other places other than Silicon Valley, which happen to touch upon Dallas and San Antonio, Austin, and of course, Houston as well. And so we're seeing growth in those various industries, which I think is healthy to have that diversification. I think also one of the key pieces about looking at the growth in our region is also looking at how we can be a leader on some of the energy changes that are taking place. How does our region become a leader? Obviously, the energy economy affects our state profoundly. And so how do we lead in respect to innovation in that regard? And I think thinking about innovation of various industries and also inclusive activity, I think is the way to go forward in terms of meeting some of the challenges that certainly we see. Just to close on the note of Houston, for example, we've got the world's largest medical center at our disposal. We've got the port at our disposal. We've got a huge energy market here, but all the challenges of yesterday will not be the challenges of tomorrow. And so anticipating what those challenges are and finding out ways that you can innovate in a way where people also who are working today will be a part of the solutions and innovation of tomorrow.
And I think I would kind of carrying column off of your point about where Texas is. I mean, we're in the middle of the country. And we're very strategically located. We've got seaport, we've got rail, we've got air. And we're like right next to Mexico. So there's kind of like this, I mean, tremendous amount of freight that goes back and forth between Mexico, which is part of the manufacturing elements of this. So certainly we're kind of like poised to continue to be this economic engine. But then, I don't want to sound kind of sentimental, but I mean, Texans work hard and they are innovative and they always have been, as far as I know. I mean, I took Texas history too, grew up here. And it's like, Texans are hard workers and they're thoughtful and they're strategic. And, essentially we've been able to take advantage of a lot of things. And we're also pretty frugal. We're very thoughtful about where we spend our money, sometimes to our disadvantage, but oftentimes it's an effective strategy. So I think it's likely that, and then if you look at our economy during the 80s, I mean, we were completely dependent on the oil and gas industry. And now it's just like we saw the oil and gas industry took a dive and Texas economy was still plugging along. So we're a very diverse economy. And then I think the other point is I think David highlighted this in terms of the strengths of each of the kind of urban cores in terms of different sectors. I mean, there's diversity within each of the urban cores, but there's strengths in them and they're all kind of interconnected with each other. And that's something that I think for our long-term interests, we have to continue to invest in that interconnectivity, certainly in terms of transportation, but other methods of collaboration and interaction as well is a really important element for our continued growth. So I think that's an important issue. And then the issue in terms of inclusiveness and our population, we're forecasting that the Latino population will exceed the non-Hispanic white population sometime this year or early next. The Latino population has contributed well over 50% of the growth of the state over the last decade. And so when you look though, and you highlighted the educational differential, that's one of our biggest challenges. I mean, so if we're not effective in supporting young Latinos, young African Americans to finish high school, to get some post-secondary educational attainment, they're not going to be the ones that are going to be filling these jobs that we're creating in the state. They're going to be people that we're importing, which is kind of what's happening right now. When you kind of look at the migration flows from California, New York, and Florida, they're all higher educated people that are coming in and filling these jobs. We need to get it to where they're Texans that are filling these jobs, because we've done an effective job supporting our young people to get them through primary and secondary education, getting them into post-secondary and landing these great jobs that we're creating. And if we don't do that, we're going to have continued and expanded income inequality and all of the ills that come along with that. So I could go on and on about that, but I'll stop there.
In our last handful of minutes, I'd like to build on this inclusiveness theme, but to really highlight, I think, something that we've touched on, Dr. Potter, you touched on it, which is, again, when we look at this mega region and compare it to others, and we talk about this a fair bit in the book, that we have a very distinctive geographic pattern that other metropolitan areas elsewhere maybe to some degree have, but we have it on steroids. And that is this enormous outward growth. You talked about the counties outside Harris County, as a lot of people will know, Collin and Denton County, north of Dallas and Fort Worth, are also enormously growing places together. They're just now reaching about 2 million people, which would make them bigger than all but 4 cities in the United States, leaving out both Dallas and Fort Worth. And it seems to me that, and we talk about this in the book, that this pattern, and as you say, Dr. Potter, net outbound migration from Harris and Dallas counties over the last decade, remarkable fact given the larger metropolitan area realities, that it carries a good, but it also carries a challenge, right? It carries the good that I think we are demonstrating that it is possible at very high speed to create high opportunity, well-functioning places in enormous size in these outlying areas in Texas, in the Texas metros. All in all, they're performing quite well. You can debate their sustainability, but clearly they're not only attracting people, they're attracting businesses and so forth. On the other hand, it means that the center of job growth is further and further away from increasingly left behind very large populations in our core cities. I would argue, we had a question in the Q&A about whether the Texas Triangle needs to be doing more to essentially improve its image in the wider country and the wider world. I would argue, if people look very closely, the left behind areas of cities like Dallas and Houston would be among the biggest black eyes we're likely to have, as it were, the biggest public relations, not just a public relations problem, it's a human problem. But this distinctive geography, how should we think about it? Is it on a track that there's nothing to be done about it? Or is there some kind of, should we be thinking about this, some kind of course correction required? Councilwoman Edwards.
Well, Cullum, I'm going to say I'm a big proponent for connectivity and meeting people where they are. And I think in, the city of Houston, for example, and I've spent a lot of time actually with having been on the statewide campaign trail and areas like North Dallas, as you've described it, I'm fully aware of that growth, and North Texas rather. And in that regard, I think what we have to do is find ways to meet people where they are so that we're connecting jobs and education centers to the people that need to be there. And so if we have transportation or transit systems that don't connect to the centers and to connect with people, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And so the question that really is posed now is, how do we best do that? Now, the first piece we're going to have to get over, it's going to require investment. We're going to have to reimagine some things that we've been doing traditionally, thinking about approaches to, for example, when you think about a working population that might be in an urban center, or if they can remain in an urban center if they've not been displaced because of gentrification, you're thinking about that. Do we have transportation that can get people to and fro from where they need to be in terms of work at the right times and at the right intervals? Those are key questions. Are we putting affordable housing in locations or spaces where there's connectivity to transit and of course to work? Because that is in fact a lot of the point, right? And so thinking about how we have systems set up so that people are connected and everyone has the opportunity to thrive. We want people who are public transit dependent to have the opportunity to thrive. And then we want people who are not to have that opportunity to thrive. And so I think we've got to really be innovative, think about meeting people where they are, and then of course, connecting people to the opportunities that they need to be successful. And I think if we think in those, with those three things in mind, whether it's transit, whether it's investment in terms of how we're building out districts, if you will, how we're building out our school system to make sure the right supports are there, that's the approach we have to take if we're going to continue to manage properly the growth that we have and that we anticipate going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Potter, the same question to you. It's our last question. These powerful geographic trends, are they inexorable? Is this our future?
Yeah, I think if you look, I look at San Antonio, I look at Houston, I look at Dallas. 10, 15 years ago, the downtowns were like, if you went downtown like after 6 o'clock, there was nobody there. And it was, there was nothing to do. And that is, our cities, I think, have done a really impressive effort, put in a really impressive effort to do urbanized development. And that in some ways has resulted in both retaining kind of a upper working class population that's living in the urbanized areas. Now that one of the challenges is then you also have this dramatic income inequality, blocks away from each other, people living blocks away from each other. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have to figure out how to overcome. And how do you maintain economic activity within the urban cores or within the urban areas? How do you grow that? And that we have seen a reversal in that, I think, historically. Hopefully we can continue that and expand on that. But then the question is, how do you ensure that there isn't displacement and that there are opportunities for the people who have lower levels of educational attainment, essentially the minority populations that are living in the urban cores? How do you get them engaged in the economic growth that is occurring and hopefully will continue to occur in the urbanized areas? So I'll stop there. I can go
Dr.
on.
Potter, Councilwoman Edwards, this has been a great Texas Triangle conversation. Not only three people in Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas having a conversation, but also actually three dogs in each of those three cities. So thank you all. Thanks to your dogs for knitting our region together. Bill, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Colum, and thank you, Dr. Potter and Councilmember Edwards, for that stimulating discussion. We have a lot of questions. What I'll try to do is reserve a little time at the end for all of the panelists to answer some of the questions. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is move on to our third and final panel, maximizing the economic potential of the Triangle. One of the things we came away from this book realizing, as Colum, and I realized it again when Colum listed the economic assets in the Triangle, is that in fact the Texas Triangle has an unbelievable endowment of economic assets, not just manufacturing companies, not just companies that do business, but also large cities with the capability of stimulating economic growth, large and important research institutions all over the Triangle, investments by the federal government, all these things. And so one of the things that we'd like to talk about now is it possible to pull all of these economic assets in the Triangle closer together to both maximize prosperity and bring as many people into that prosperity as possible. Because as Colum and Lloyd both said, bringing people up has been a problem. To discuss this, we have four panelists. Laura Huffman, President and CEO of the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce, who's sort of in the middle of this Austin tech thing right now. Paul Cherukuri, who is the Executive Director of the Rice University Institute of Biosciences and Bioengineering here in Houston, who's sort of at the cutting edge of research being converted into spin-off businesses. Ross Gibb, Executive Director of the George H.W. Bush Combat Development Complex at Texas A&M University, who was a critical player in bringing the Army Futures Command to Texas, which creates a lot of economic opportunities that we want to talk about. And Jenna Saucedo Herrera, President and CEO of the San Antonio Economic Development Foundation. Thanks to all of you for participating today. I'd like to kick it off by going around the horn and asking each of you, what do you think is the biggest economic opportunity you see in the Triangle right now? And how can the different institutions and economic players in the Triangle work together to maximize the opportunity that you've identified? Jenna, why don't we start with you? Are you out there? Can't tell whether everybody's there.
I am. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, though, after the two previous panels, I think our work is done. I'm not really sure there's much more that this panel can add, but thank you for the opportunity to participate. I think the answer is simple there, and it's talent. That's our greatest economic opportunity in my humble opinion. And all of the stats about inbound migration were already mentioned, but I'd say it's a growing workforce and a diverse workforce at that, right? So in San Antonio, we're a majority minority community at 56% Latino. We represent demographically the future of the state of Texas and the future of the United States of America. And so I think really leaning into that opportunity and aligning efforts from a talent pipeline development perspective across the Triangle is what will benefit us the most and really differentiate us the most going forward.
How do you think that alignment can occur in ways that it hasn't occurred already? The alignment and workforce development across the metro, say.
Yeah, so I think it starts with alignment in our own respective locales. And that word sounds pretty simple, but Laura can attest it's actually pretty challenging. So in San Antonio, we're fortunate enough to have both large Texas systems present here, right? Texas A&M San Antonio, which is expected to be the second largest institution in the A&M system in the next 10 years, and of course, the University of Texas at San Antonio. But we really have 16 universities. And so pooling those folks together, alignment with economic development pursuits and really filling the pipeline for in-demand occupations has been step one. But I know that they are now working on alignment with their peers. And I think from an operational perspective, that's the way that you can truly move forward collaboratively when the chambers are working together from a policy perspective through Metro 8. When the economic development organizations like Opportunity Austin, GHP, the EDF, when we're working together operationally to co-market the mega region, when the energy organizations, when the transportation organizations, when we are benchmarking and aligning operationally, I think that's when you can truly move forward. There's a lot of talk about collaboration from a political perspective, and I think that matters, certainly. But we really need to move beyond the elements of parochial politics within our respective communities and think bigger about the opportunities within the Triangle, and in my opinion.
Okay, thanks. Ross at A&M, let's turn to you. You've been in the middle of a whole new wave of Pentagon investment in the Triangle, both operationally and possibly also in the research area. What opportunity does that provide to the Triangle, and how can the Triangle institutions work together to maximize the value of that opportunity?
Yeah, thanks. So you mentioned Army Futures Command, and that organization is the largest reorganization of the Army since 1973. And when it was looking for a home, really the goal was how do we deliver something from the labs to the user quicker and with more meaning. Austin and the approach that Texas had was about regions, actually. Is the way they pitched it to Army Futures Command. So this is really appropriate for the discussion. And they spoke about the regions in a couple of ways, not only academically by region, also the tech by region, and then also the business aspect by region. But there are organizations, I think awareness is the biggest thing. You know, if I have a proposal here, I need to know which region to partner with because they have something that really differentiates them from everybody else. And part of it is awareness. You know, I work with a group called the National Security Innovation Council, and that's part of their remit is to try to get the word out about what's important. You know, we're tied geographically to the greater Houston area. How can we harness, or what do we bring to the table in terms of this kind of proposal to government or to industry? But we're also in a $200 million investment here by the state of Texas, by Texas A&M, and by Department of Defense through Army Futures Command. And I would say that state of Texas in our innovation proving ground, which is a $50 million investment, is for all the universities to use as part of their research kind of business area, and not specifically for Texas A&M. So we're starting to see where we're not going to be parochial. This is all about how do we make this idea of Texas and this idea of the strengths of Texas more important to the United States and not just to a particular region. So happy to talk about any of those things, but we are looking to be kind of a national research ecosystem here.
Yeah. What kind of R&D and business opportunities do you see commercially, non-militarily spinning off out of the Army Futures Command being in Texas?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, part of the kind of the vision is how do we get small business, this real kind of innovation, how do we get that kind of ethos from within the United States to Department of Defense? As most of us know here, if you are a startup, the last thing you need is to get into our planning cycles for business 2 years later, because you'll no longer exist as a small startup. But what we found is that if we help those small businesses either work with larger ones and or help them see that there is a commercial and a kind of a government application, help them work through those areas that, they could have their cake and eat it too, so to speak.
Thanks, Ross. Paul, let's turn to you. Paul Cherukuri at the Institute for Biosciences and Bioengineering at Rice. You're in the middle of the Med Center. You're quite literally, geographically, physically in the middle of the Med Center. How do you see the research and spinoff opportunities in the Triangle, and how do you make sure that it's more than just SMU in Dallas and UT in Austin and A&M in College Station and us at Rice? How do you make sure that everybody in the Triangle, all these research institutions are working together to maximize economic and spinoff and commercialization opportunity?
That's the billion-dollar question. I think it's an exciting.
It's a billion-dollar question, not $1 million question.
Not a million. I think it's $1 billion. I mean, that's a big issue, right? One of the things that I think is culturally very interesting about Houston, probably the Texas Triangle in general, we don't brag enough about ourselves. We don't tell each other what we're doing often enough, right? We kind of stumble, and that's what Ross was talking about, Jen was talking. I think we all have this sort of issue that we don't really, talk about ourselves like they do on the East and West Coast. And I think that's part of the answer of, trying to communicate this sort of communicate what we're all doing. How do you effectively do that? And do we have organizations to do that? NSIC that Ross mentioned is also one big piece of that, to be able to communicate what's happening in the DoD space. But with the TMC, it is the world's largest medical center. It's the world's largest medical complex. But even within the pockets of the Med Center, they don't really talk to each other as well as we would like. That's part of the idea that TMC needs to do that better. We need to do that better with them. So we bridge, and the way we bridge is really, it's still through conversations, right? Really talking to each other about what we're doing. And having that sort of direct communication was really, for example, one of the things that I think the TMC did very well during the COVID period. All the leadership of TMC were meeting, the presidents were meeting every day to talk about how they were going to coordinate the COVID response, right? And that was a self-assembled sort of structure based on the pandemic. Well, there's also this other sort of national threat that we're facing, both in innovation and research. And how do you drive health technology out from the TMC? One of the things Rice does is we build a lot of the tools that the TMC would use, right? The clinicians would use. We're not a medical school. Rice does not have a medical school. We work with people across the street. So how do we partner with those folks to help them do healthcare better? But ultimately, it's because, as we all know, healthcare in America is very expensive. We have not brought the cost down. So there is an incredible underserved population that has not benefited from the research that we're having in our labs. And a lot of that innovation is actually tied back to the DoD and de-risked, because there's a lot of innovation in health tech that the DoD is investing in. And so I partner with Ross and with other entities across the Texas Triangle to see if we can unify these efforts. But most people don't really know about all those pieces.
Yeah.
And we're trying to pull those together.
I want to, Laura Hoffman, I want to get to you in a minute, particularly talking about tech in Austin. But Paul, I want to, before we move on, I want to ask you a follow-up question, because as you mentioned, DoD investment and the spinoff availability of that, or the spinoff effect of that, you and I have talked in our conversations. I've been really struck by your thoughts about how the Triangle today is positioned in many ways, partly because of Pentagon investment, in the same way Silicon Valley was, say, 40, 50 years ago, and you see the possibility of a similar trajectory.
Yeah, I think what's great that we're sort of second to the Silicon model, right? We can learn about what they did and what Terman did as provost of Stanford and the analog of what we're having here at Rice, right? So if Rice can actually do startup creation like they did at Stanford for Silicon Valley, we can translate that here. But then on top of that, we have the energy industry that already exists, and we also have the healthcare industry that already exists here, right? So trying to merge those, trying to benefit both sides of that inside of the Texas Triangle, and then partner back to San Antonio and Dallas, I think we can be an exemplar for the US. And that's something, like I said, we learn from the mistakes of Silicon Valley. And some of the mistakes are that we want to be able to create innovation with jobs. I mean, that's one of the central goals of what we're trying to do as a university. And I think as the Triangle, that's got to be the number one goal, and bring manufacturing back, like physical manufacturing, not just digital. And those are the kinds of things that I think Texas Triangle is uniquely positioned to do.
Okay, thank you. Laura Hoffman, Austin Chamber of Commerce, thanks for joining us. You are certainly in the middle of everything right now. You're in the middle of probably the hottest tech economy in the world. What opportunity do you see, and how can all the different institutions in the Triangle work together to maximize that opportunity?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me. It's been just an incredibly interesting conversation. I'm having to put my pen down from taking notes so that I can say something. So I'm going to I would wholeheartedly agree with what Jenna said, and I'm going to say something different just to get another thought process out there. And what I would say is, for purposes of this discussion, like how do we really maximize and optimize these big regional economies? I would say resilience. And the reason I would say resilience is because of everything I've heard so far today, right? We're in the midst of an abundance period in our state. And so we should be thinking about how we can leverage all of the people that are coming, all the companies that are coming, the kinds of jobs, our higher educational institution, and we should be thinking about resilience. We should be thinking about it differently, perhaps, than people have talked about it before. So when I think about how could we work together, and what would be important, necessary work for this triangle to think about together, resilience to me is talent. The reason people are coming to Texas, the reason companies are coming to each of our major cities, they're not making a bet on talent. They're seeing the talent already, and it's not talent that they're bringing from outside of Texas. First and foremost, it's local talent. And so we have to get ever better at how do we educate and train our own people? How do we keep them home? How do we create quality of life for that talent? And just said in a super short way, how do we treat our people as our most important natural resource in the state? And that's a big piece of us becoming more resilient. And I'm going to talk about I want to say one thing about more resilient. We're not resilient enough. We've had a couple of tryouts this year on the resilience front. We had a tryout with a storm. We've had several tryouts with floods. We had a tryout with some droughts. We've had tryouts with a pandemic. We are not resilient enough. So the reason that we have to think about our people as our most important natural resource is because that's why people are coming here. 2 is capacity. We just have to look at infrastructure. In many instances, we are at the end of the capacity for either transportation, water, storms, you name it. But we have to be thinking as a region about what kind of capacity do we need? And also, what does capacity mean for the future? So, for example, the pandemic taught a lot of people, and hopefully we're all going to really, really pause and think about the lessons learned. We didn't talk about daycare as infrastructure seriously before the pandemic, but we are now. We've been talking about digital divide for a long time, but the pandemic, that put a much brighter light on that type of capacity. So we have to define capacity for the economies of the future, and then we have to double down and invest. And then the third area of resilience for me, I wasn't exactly sure how to say this because I was trying to be diplomatic, but each of our major cities are going to have to become better problem solvers. If I think about the problems that each of these regions, each of the points in the triangle have experienced over the last 3 to 4 years, and the problems that we're likely to experience in the next 5, we have to be better big city problem solvers. We have to find ways to work with each other. We have to find ways to stop fighting with the state. We have to find, we're all experiencing, whether it's public safety, homelessness, issues of social justice. There are some big issues that these cities are facing, and we have to become more sophisticated problem solvers. And of course, the key to that is to not assign problems to one institution or to one sector. And I think there are some bright spots in Texas, but I think in general, we're using sort of old school problem solving, like hand it off to the government and hope it works out okay, or say it's a private sector problem, or pray that the nonprofit sector will come to the rescue. And I think the problems that we're experiencing just defy that format. And so my answer to you, Bill, is resilience. And that's talent, that's capacity, and defining infrastructure in new and different ways. And it's, our urban areas becoming really sophisticated models of problem solving.
Are there a couple of questions, a couple of quick follow-up questions before we move on about that. I'm really interested in that. Big cities need to be better problem solvers. Are there models from other parts of the country that we can adopt without becoming New York or California? Because I think that clearly to move forward, we're going to have to find the Texas way to move forward. And secondly, is there a path toward working constructively with the state on these issues instead of the state and the cities fighting with each other?
Well, to answer the second question first, there has to be, and we can't even make it a binary choice. We have to start working, in an interrelated way with our cities and our counties and our state government for all the reasons that you guys set up in the book. To not do that is to put the entire success of this state at risk, right? The stakes are much, much too high to debate whether or not we are going to do it. The real question is, how are we going to do it? So yes, and then on the problem solving front, I think that I do think that there are some examples from around the country. There are definitely some lessons learned. And so
good and bad.
I think we get a lot of, no, I think good and bad, to be fair. For example, I think that Houston has done one of the best jobs in the country on the homeless issue.
Yes.
And, I think that Austin just passed one of the most robust mobility programs with the most reliable funding stream over time and sort of an innovative governance structure, probably one of the best in the country. Now it's got to get implemented, but its structure is nice. So yes, we can learn from one another within the state, and we can learn from beyond the state. But I also think this to me plays into our personality so beautifully. Let's be that state that figures out how to tackle tough problems and use sort of that, that Texas independence and that Texas grit for, calling a spade and then just getting really creative. And I actually think that could become one of our distinguishing characteristics as a state, because back to resilience, the whole thing about resilience is you're going to see disruption, and it's not going to look the same next year as it did this year. And so if you don't become good problem solvers, then you can't take a punch. And what we've seen even in the course of the last 18 months is resilience is becoming ever more important.
Let me ask Jenna and Laura, the two economic development CEOs. You both talked about talent, and you've both talked about, as did Lloyd, about this issue of bringing workers in from the outside and educating people who grow up in the triangle, making sure they have opportunity. What's the best way to introduce equity into this discussion and make sure that this incredible prosperity that we can foster if we work together more actually benefits everybody?
So let me chime in here. First of all, I want to actually take us back because Laura, Paul, loved what you all were saying about specifically resiliency, but also about the key industries, Paul, that you highlighted. You mentioned healthcare, you mentioned energy, you mentioned manufacturing. I have got to add in there information security, cybersecurity, and think about how well those different industries overlap so nicely. And so if there is truly a way to position the state of Texas, it's in the overlap of those industries that lead to resiliency, Laura, that you were talking through, because infrastructure is not just the physical infrastructure, right? As you mentioned, it's talent, and it's also the cyber element of all of the above. And as you all know, I mean, San Antonio's prowess in cyber can't be matched with the 16th Air Force, FBI Cyber, NSA Texas, UTSA having the top cyber program in the country. So nonetheless, I think there's definitely some alignment there, and we really do need to lean into that as a state. But coming back to your question about equity, this is huge. And let's be very honest with ourselves. I don't think anybody's figured it out. Clearly, this is a conversation that we are having across the country. And I am not proud to say that San Antonio and the MSA here is one of the most income segregated communities in the country, right? Not proud of that at all. I mentioned we're a majority minority community. Yeah, well, we also have some pockets of our community that we have not brought along very well. I think it starts by reframing that conversation because unfortunately, equity is seen as one of those divisive buzzwords right now in the political sphere. I think it's about economic mobility, right? If you want to position your economy, if you truly want to propel an economy and move it forward, you've got to bring everybody along. It is truly an all ships rise concept. And if you're not investing in education, you're not addressing poverty, you're not addressing income inequality. And I think it all boils down, there were some comments in the chat earlier, but I think it all boils down to education. That's investing in your people. And that's both talent development, that's talent retention, that's talent recruitment. At the end of the day, education is the reason that Texas is one of the top performing economies in the country. And we've got to keep it that way by investing in our people. But I think it's about economic mobility, and that should address equity challenges.
Very interesting point about the overlapping business sectors. I want to get back to that, but Laura or anybody else, you want to address that equity question?
Well, look, I want to build on what Jenna's saying. I do think that education and how we think about people, our talent, our local talent, because we've got diversity in our cities already. So how are we thinking about keeping and promoting that diversity? I also think that there can be, so it is, I agree, it's education. It's making sure that people have real opportunities. I think we can probably do a better job of connecting some of our smaller educational institutions to our larger educational institutions. Had an interesting conversation this morning with Concordia College, and they're a part of the solution when it comes to providing diverse talent for the future. And so I think we, love a research university, and I think they serve a super important purpose. I think there's a question about whether or not we need at least one more of them to serve this growing economy. But I also think we don't want to leave out some of our smaller educational institutions. Because I think they can play an outsized role in this question, and they have perspectives and they have experience that perhaps we don't have. The second thing I think could be really, all this is taking advantage of an opportunity is as we grow, the businesses that are either growing in our state or locating to our state, they have this top of mind also. And it plays out with how they're hiring. It plays out with how they're developing workforce. It plays out with, it's actually even starting to play out with the kinds of positions that they take that they never used to take at all in the policy arena. I think the bathroom bill of a session ago was an example of, you know, the business community in Texas taking a position, maybe not because they wanted to, but because, you know, if you're competing for talent, then talent looks at the values of a company. And what I hear over and over and over again is in the competition for talent, if I'm 23 years old and there are four $60,000 a year jobs, then I can start asking harder questions. I can start asking, right? I can start looking at the values of the company and the demonstration of those values. So I would just emphasize what Jenna said, it is education. Just add, let's look at some of these smaller educational institutions that have, you know, their power alley is diversity. And then let's pull these companies into the mix and see how we can connect all this together.
Let me go back to on the question of the other educational institutions. Let me go back to Paul and Ross, who are of course at major research institutions. Paul, you and I have talked about this. What role do the other, say, community colleges and other educational institutions play, and how do the major research institutions interact with other higher education institutions like community colleges to make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? Paul, you're nodding your head, so I'm going to ask you. And Ross, I'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah,
But Paul nods his head a lot, actually.
I do. And mainly because I'm excited and agree with everyone so far. It's been wonderful. There are so many aspects of this, but this is really a very appropriate sort of moment for this question. Just yesterday, we had our institute, we host undergraduates from different universities and colleges, also HBCUs. We brought them in. We created a new program this year that was funded by Rice to bring in HBCU students to come to do summer research over this period, over the next 10 weeks. And what was amazing was we all realized, all of us who were running the programs, who were teaching in these classes, we just realized that that was the first time we had gathered all our students together since COVID really started, right? So we had so many people out here in our courtyard open area at our research facility. And it was just, I think some of us were tearing up at the thought of this, right? And the idea was that we were bringing students in, not only post-COVID, but these were HBCU students who had never stepped foot on a research university like this, right? They never had that opportunity. And now and it was just inspirational to see that. So that's part of the way that we're engaging the different colleges. We want students from diverse backgrounds to come to graduate school, even at Rice. We also extend out to K through 12, and we're trying to bridge to the other universities and other colleges. That is a big part of what Rice is doing. And it talks to what you were saying, Jenna, which was really spot on. The idea of education, it's changed. It's no longer the 18 to 20 some year old population, right? We're all living longer. We're also aging as we're getting there. But on top of that, we're wanting to learn more and more. So these lifelong learner systems that Rice is also rolling out, right? Our online education, because of the pandemic, higher ed is under a transformation, right? Engaging more students is an important part of this. And then pulling in people who don't have the opportunity to physically come to the middle of Houston, right? How do you bring those folks in? How do you make it compelling and also rewarding? And then training, just pure straight training, because people want to work with Rice and we want to work with other communities to be able to grow that for the region. And that's a different mindset that Rice has only the last few years is really wanting to engage beyond our hedges. I think that's an important part of it.
Okay.
Bill,
and Ross.
Just one more quick comment on. I just want to point to Christina Aldretti's comment and say I agree. It is 2-year and 4-year colleges. It's also certification programs. And so I want to keep this conversation as expansive as possible. It's about how do we take our young Texans and how do we put them on the path to be a part of this growing modern economy that we're creating. And then I also just want to thank, we got a nice caution there, and I want to thank the person that made that comment. Thank you.
Thanks. Ross, back to the question of the different types of educational institutions. What opportunity do you see for them working together to maximize this economic opportunity for everybody?
Yeah, so, we have I'll go to an Army Futures Command example, right? So they have a software factory that they just opened up. They did that in Austin, and they're partnered with Austin Community College as kind of the strength of that program. So it shows that we can partner with, 2-year, smaller 4-year colleges, and that you can get maximum effect. I am in dialogue with Dallas College. They reached out to me asking me to help them expose their population with the things that we're doing. Just again, it's about awareness, about doing things maybe that they're not aware of, that they can support national security or the intelligence community or Department of Defense or industry, just in a different role, right? You don't have to wear a uniform. You can do things. I'm really kind of laser focused, just to put a little bit of finer point on this whole idea of education on the STEM portion of education, right? So we need to have overmatch in those areas, but it starts at a younger age than high school, right? We're working on some very exquisite things as a nation, and we need to get back to some areas where, we were, leading, but because for a lot of reasons we're not leading potentially. And I think the important thing there is, can we have a resurgence in, STEM education to really, because that's tied to innovation as well, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that are tied to innovation and having this culture of innovation. And I think education, as Laura and Jenna and Paul have said, it seems like that's the key. And it gives you access to different things. Let's face it, open some doors that potentially would not open for you. But those are kind of my focus areas. I just gave you kind of 2 examples. And with the Dallas College piece, I connected them with the National Security Innovation Network, which is a DoD or OSD organization that kind of helps, these universities and or colleges along, and kind of gives them a different pathway to maybe a different end state that they weren't themselves aware of. So I'll pause there.
Okay, thanks. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left. On the questions, many of the questions, I thank the panelists for addressing the questions in their remarks. We'll capture all the questions and try to get everybody answers after this session. But last question, just quickly going around the 4 of you. Everybody has articulated, in addition to education and talent, the need for greater connection, the need to know, the need to sort of talk about what you're doing and connect so that you all know what each other is doing, so you can better take advantage of opportunities together. I'm wondering, coming out of this event today, what can everybody do to stay connected and maintain those connections more than they have in the past? Laura, let's start with you.
Well, one thing that we do already that I should have pointed out is the economic development and chamber organizations are connected in a lot of different ways in Texas. In fact, Jenna, I think that we were working with a prospect yesterday and drove them halfway down to San Antonio, and then you guys met us halfway to pick them up and show them San Antonio. So some of these things are happening already. It's not just a competition. We recognize that we each have different kinds of assets and different kinds of personalities that, but the other thing is there's actual, there is coordination. The Metro 8 is the 8 largest chambers in the state. We coordinate, on these kinds of issues as well as legislative and policy issues. So some of that is happening already. I think because talent is such I think we've got a little bit of a puzzle to solve here, as a group, which is what is the right way to convene around this issue of talent? So we started the conversation, with research, institutions. We grew it to include smaller colleges. We grew it again to include 2-year. We grew it again to include certifications. The work that Jenna and I do, like we're trying to create the best prizes at the end of all that possible. These wonderful, not just jobs, but career trajectories for people. And so, Bill and Cullum and Henry, I mean, I think we could all stand to figure out how do we convene so that we don't fill a stadium, but we get some really good conversation going. But there is we're growing the economy for a purpose. and the purpose and the talent need to be connected differently.
Okay. Jenna?
Well, I think everything Laura said was right on the mark. So amen to that. I would just add that, beyond our research institutions, organizations, our private sector, right? I mean, we no longer compete. We're just kidding ourselves if we think we compete across the state of Texas, right? Think about my largest Fortune 100s or largest employers, USAA, Valero, HEB. They have a presence across the entire state. And that is what uniquely positions them to be competitive, right? I mean, you can take Frostbank, Cape Dawson, I mean, you name it, they've got an expansive presence. And so if we can truly think about how to, as Paul mentioned, story and better position ourselves, I think that's what's going to make the difference. But again, it's moving beyond what we thought we did in the past, which was compete with each other, to truly collaborate as a state and as a mega region.
Okay. Ross, how can we better connect and know about each other's opportunities in the way that you described? No, I think you're muted.
I do my best work in mute, so. I think forums like this, it helps, expose people to, I certainly learned a lot in this forum, how we can get this, from Hollywood Squares into, something where we have real outputs that we want from these, and really, again, how we can share and collaborate, and then show some good news stories, right? I tried to open up with a couple of good news stories saying, the state of Texas, gave us this $50 million for the Innovation Proving Ground. It wasn't for Texas A&M. It was for the universities in Texas A&M. We're just the caretakers of it, right? So, maybe we are moving the needle a little bit. And then the other one I gave was, this regional approach that's old Army Futures Command to Secretary McCarthy. I know I was on that trip with him and really kind of said, hey, it's not what the Army can do for Texas. Basically, it was what can Texas do for the Army? Okay. And to get a 4-star command, the only Army 4-star command west of the Mississippi. I mean, we should be proud of that as a state, to say we galvanized about, this kind of problem set, and we came with a solution. And just my last, and, really the Austin Chamber is really, kind of championing that, kind of the spearhead. And then, there's a fallacy, I think, sometimes there's a rivalry, I get it. But we have UT coming next week as an example on that Innovation Proving Ground to work on some things with us, or work with just their partners. Paul knows that we partner a lot with Rice, or we try to collaborate on how we can, kind of make our region more of a powerhouse, and then how do we, bring this all together. But it's forums like this, Bill, you and your other co-authors really, can help continue to move the needle by just bringing awareness to the population. So I appreciate
Paul,
it.
Thank you, Russ. Sorry, we're just about out of time, but Paul, last word, how do we all stay connected?
Yeah, so staying connected, I think, is critical to this, and then really dovetailing into that, really forming a strategy around our different capabilities. I think once we know our stories, like we've been saying, once we know what we're all about and talk to each other about it, you can really start to galvanize. And I think that's like some of the stuff that we've been doing with Ross and A&M and other institutions like UT Austin. Those are our research universities, but that public-private partnership, I think, is critical. That's what made Rice even stronger. And I think Texas is really emerging from that sort of ethos. So hopefully we can continue these conversations and formulate a real strategy around it.
Okay, great. Well, I want to say thanks to all of you. We're out of time. Thanks to all of our panelists today. We came out of this project very interested in learning how to tighten relationships across the triangle, both for economic and social purposes. If you have any follow-ups speaking to the audience, if you have any follow-ups that you want to suggest, I'm going to put my email in the chat there. I just put it in there. Please stay in touch with me and let me know what we at the Kinder Institute and Bush and SMU and the other institutes can do. The Texas Triangle, as was said in the chat, is available for purchase at local stores. Brazos in Houston, Twig in San Antonio, Interabang in Dallas. Those are your major local independent bookstores. I just went over to Brazos the other day and signed some books. I know that Cullum is planning to do the same at Interabang and Henry and David at Twig. You can also buy the books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and straight from tamupress.com. Our next Kinder Institute Forum will be June 16th, which will feature Fred Wary, Princeton professor and director of the Dignity and Debt Network, speaking on financial literacy and equity and debt. We at the Kinder Institute will share our findings from our new 2021 State of Housing in Houston and Harris County report on June 22nd. And then this series, Urban Reads, sponsored by CenterPoint, will return on August 11th with Leslie Kern discussing her book, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. You can register for any upcoming webinar by visiting kinder.rice.edu or scanning the QR code on your screen. Again, we will capture all of the questions and respond and keep this conversation going. Thanks very much for participating today and have a wonderful day. Thanks to the panelists as well.